Okay, welcome back everybody. This week we're going to talk about the security manager and security leadership. And we're going to define the difference between management and leadership, at least from a context that relates to our roles. And a couple things before we get started. The first one is that the reading that you've done, and if you haven't done the reading, please stop now and go back and do it, because none of this will make sense, and you certainly are not going to be able to do the discussion this week unless you finish the reading. It just isn't possible. So if you haven't done the reading, please go do that. But the reading this week really casts security guards, security officers, the frontline security force in a negative way. And that's not really fair. There are well over 1 million people in the United States who are employed as security officers, more than twice as many as police officers. And just as we see, with police, everyone knows that not all police are good and not all police are bad. I mean, we all know that. That is a fact, and anybody that wants to argue that can certainly give me a call. But the same is true with security officers. Many are very hardworking, good people who just want to make a living, do their job, do it well, and go home, just like the vast majority of people in the world. But there are some bad actors, and the articles we're going to read definitely emphasize those bad actors. So I want you to make sure that when you're thinking about the reading, don't think of it as, oh my gosh, such disarray that it's totally broken, we have to throw it away. They are emphasizing the bad cases. And that's important that we understand that those are real cases, and these things may or may not have really happened. In most cases, they've been investigated and have. But also do some very critical reading. When they say so-and-so was accused of something, that does not necessarily mean the person did that. We know accusations are made all the time. We also know that if something was investigated and it was found to be true, that we should accept it as true, unless we find fault in the investigation, which is pretty hard to do in most of these cases. So again, take the reading for what it's worth. Make sure you're keeping an open mind to the fact that they are giving you the worst case scenario and the worst cases to consider, but don't let that cast a pall on the entire industry. Second thing about the reading, which I just kind of found interesting, was I picked these readings out in 2019 because I've used them in previous classes. And they are still valid today and still good, I think, for our purpose, because I go through the readings every course to see what's changed. What I did find, though, that I thought was kind of interesting is there are two people that are quoted, one in the USA Today article and one in the Pew Trust article, and that is our own Dr. Hodge and Dr. Nemeth. Did not know Dr. Hodge before when I picked out that article. Knew Dr. Nemeth, but failed to pick up on the quotation from him. I didn't know him well. Had read some of his books. So interestingly enough, two of our Slippery Rock faculty members in this program are quoted in the articles you're going to read, which should give you some good feeling about the program that you chose. That our faculty are sought out for expert opinions by some pretty good news outlets. So with that, let's get started. Let's talk about leadership versus management. One thing I didn't mention, though, was that I'm going to try to make this lecture a little bit less than the 45 minutes because you do have a lot of reading, and I want that balance that I promised you. So I'll go as quickly as I can and still be effective. So for our definitions, management is the lawful and proper application of resources to produce a profit or other goal. Management concerns processes. Leadership is the act of motivating and guiding people to accomplish established goals in an ethical and concerted way. Leadership concerns people and compliance with processes. So, what we're talking about here is that management is the rules, the written rules that we go by. The self-imposed rules in many cases about how we're going to operate our business. We're going to open at 9 a.m. and we're going to close at 5 p.m. That is a management decision. Leadership ensures that somebody is there to open the doors at 9 and somebody stays till 5 to stay open to enforce that. So let's look at it in just another couple of examples. So we make sure we get the delineation between management and leadership from our definitions here to make sure we're talking about the two distinct things, because when you start to do your analysis, you're going to need to know the difference. So many of you know in most states, probably back when you were in elementary school, we had a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. And actually, both the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit and the drinking age of 21 years are both tied to federal funding, which most people don't know. The federal government said, we will give you highway funds at 100% of your allocated amount if you have a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit and you have a law that says people under the age of 21 cannot drink legally. And some states said, well, we make more money by having a 70-mile-an-hour speed limit, especially some of the large western states. You think Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, kept their, and Colorado as well, kept their speed limits at 70 because they made a lot of money from taxes on trucks driving through, going from coast to coast. They would route their truck routes through these states so that they could take advantage of a higher speed limit, in some cases 75 miles an hour. And if they went 55, they would avoid those states. They would go through another state that had a higher speed limit so they could get their load quicker, because truck drivers are paid by the mile. They want to get point A to point B quickly. So the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, though, was tied to the whole idea of safety, right? So we have this 55-mile-an-hour speed limit in some states, and that is the rule, and that is tied to reducing traffic deaths. If you go slower, you have less deaths. That's, it's you can still have a death at 10 miles an hour, and you can live through a 100-mile-an-hour crash. We've all heard the outliers, but generally speaking, the slower you go, the more chance you have to live in an accident. 55-mile-an-hour speed limit there was put in to limit traffic fatalities. That's the management side. We put up the signs, we made the law. The leadership side then took over to provide traffic patrols, to educate drivers. The old saying was 55 saves lives, and to set up the courts to handle the influx of speeders, especially in the first years of this when you had people having to go slower than they were normally going. But the leadership side was the enforcement side, making sure people actually obeyed those management rules we put in place. Management being the actual rules themselves, leadership being the function that makes sure the rules get obeyed. Neither one can operate effectively without the other. Think about if we decided that we were going to put up 55-mile-an-hour speed limit signs but didn't have any police patrols to enforce it and no courts that would give you a fine. How many people would go 55? No one would really change their habits and drive slower. They would drive what they reasonably believe to be a good speed, which for some people, as we all know, is 45, and others is 95. So without the management in place, we would have no ability to function. Then again, with the leadership, with the management, if we didn't have the signs, but we just pulled over people indiscriminately to say you're going too fast, how could that be fair? And how could a person know when they're going too fast according to someone else? So again, you need the management rules and the leadership enforcement functions to operate effectively. And that goes for any business too. You have rules that you set for yourself in many cases. And then you have leadership that enforces those rules to make sure that you're doing what you say you're going to do. So what we're looking at this week is actually a case study. And many of you have probably done case studies in other courses. And the case is the G4S case from the USA Today article. Really, that's the basis for our case, and the others offer an awful lot of supporting arguments for different sides of that case. It's a 2019 case. Many of the cases listed there are, may have been adjudicated but under appeal. So we're going to go with what we know from the 2019 article. You certainly can look up and look at dispositions of some of those cases if they've yet been adjudicated or finally decided. But go with what you know in the article if you so choose, because I think it really presents the case. It presents the worst case scenario, as news articles often do, right? The news is part reporting and part sensationalism, no matter who reports it. And there's a certain spin on any news article, be it one way or the other, pro something, anti something. It's very common. You as an academic have to discern if the issues are systemic or anecdotal. If they're just thrown out, well, this happened and that happened, okay, fine. I mean, you can't say that there was a slip and fall on the Slippery Rock campus, therefore all roadways are slick and people should not be walking. It may have just been somebody with no coordination like me that slipped and fell. So you have to discern which are really systemic issues. Is the entire campus icy all the time and they're not, protecting the roads? Or is it just Brian out there slipping and falling because Brian has no coordination? You as an academic have to kind of look at that. Look for patterns. That's really what's key. And patterns in all of the articles, not just the G4S one, but look at patterns in all of them. What are you finding that really are the things that stick out that you say, this is why this problem occurs more likely than others? And then look at legal mandates versus society's expectations. What is the law telling guard companies they must do versus what people think they're telling them what they must do? Is it something criminal? It may be a failure of management. It may be a failure of leadership. Look at each one of these cases and say to yourself, what really happened here? Were there no rules? Therefore, this happened? Or were there rules and nobody followed them? That's why this happened? Or should there have been a law rather than a rule, then everybody would have had to follow it? Look at each one of these cases as you read through it and try to determine whether it's a potential failure of leadership or management. Since the basis of this case study in the articles really is about crimes committed by security officers, and in this case by security officers in one company, although the other articles discuss it broadly across the industry, if you look at the rate of crimes committed, this is one of those spin things that I want to make you aware of. In the general population, you'll see that there are 3,888 crimes per 100,000 people committed in the U.S. per year. G4S employees, the crimes committed were 1,587 per 100,000 employees. So essentially, G4S employees are committing crimes at half the rate of the general population, based on the research done in the articles. So, to try to say that G4S has nothing but criminals and they run amok, well, that's not entirely true. They certainly that 1,587 crimes per 100,000 employees is not acceptable. 0 is acceptable in the security industry, in my opinion, but we're never going to find that. We're not going to find utopia. And in fact, when we compare that, there are almost 1,000 crimes per 100,000 police officers committed each year in the U.S. These are crimes that they're arrested for. So, our police officers are committing crimes at only 25% of that of the general population, but that's still pretty darn. So if we're looking for, if we're reading those articles and really discerning what's, sensationalism versus what's truth, keep in mind that although the security officers that they mention, and they mention a lot of individual cases, this person did this person did that, the crime rate among employees with G4S, and I suggest other security companies are about equal, is about half or less than half that of the general population, and only slightly higher, well, a little bit more than slightly, but not much higher than that for police officers. So when you read the article in this case study, I want you to think about potential arguments you could make. And you're going to have to hone in on one argument as your main one before we're done. So here's some just potential arguments. G4S should have known not to hire those cited in the article. They should have had processes in place, and those processes should have been followed. They should have known these people were dangerous. They shouldn't have hired them. Argument could say that they were negligent in hiring because they didn't check all available sources. You could say that they should have properly investigated the internal complaints, because a lot of these eventual outcomes were red flags all around them from internal complaints from other employees saying this person isn't right, this person isn't treating me well, this person has committed a crime against me. So you could say, that G4S should have known in the first place, or they were just negligent because they didn't check all the sources. They only checked the sources that the law may have required them to check. And again, is that their fault if that's what they're required to check? And they should have investigated the internal complaints to avoid some of those outcomes. Would that have helped them? Did they fail in leadership? They had the rules in place, they just didn't lead. So there's a couple of potential arguments, and there are more. You could also take the other tact and argue that G4S did the minimum legal checks that they're required to do. There's no reason, there's no law, there's no management function that says that they need to go beyond that. In fact, to do that would make them less competitive than other people in some cases. So when we had that 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, are we saying that some drivers can only go 45 because that's better for them? And we're going to enforce 45 on some drivers and 55 on others. Would that be fair to those other drivers who now must go even slower and get to their destination even later? A lot of the cases that are cited occurred after the person was hired. And a background check is done at hire. Now, a background check was done on me in 1987 on hire, And although I've had a couple of them since then for government clearances, any employee that was hired the same year as me in the company that I work for today would not have had a recheck on their background check. It's not required except for in certain positions. During that 30 plus years, anything could have happened. I mean, I could have had domestic violence arrests. I haven't. Could have had DUIs. By the way, I haven't. But anything could have happened. The company would not know because it happened after hire. And in the case of G4S, many of these incidents that are listed in the articles happened after hire. And then finally, the mental health variable. You can hire somebody and they appear to be quite stable and, they're the type of person you want to hire. And outside influences, domestic issues, financial issues, just simple, biological mental health issues take place, and this person does something. In the case of Mateen, that was the shooter in the Orlando nightclub, a G4S employee. Could G4S have foreseen that he was going to do that? I think had they done that, they would have certainly got him out of their employ to avoid bad press, if nothing else, and hopefully would have contacted authorities to say this guy's a real potential problem. But mental health is a variable, and it's a snapshot in time when you're hired, and no employer can really tell, even with a psychological exam, can really tell what you're going to do 1 minute to the next. That is a personal decision, and sometimes controllable, sometimes not. When you're making that argument, deciding which argument you think, really, and we're really talking about, was it a failure of management or a failure of leadership? Were the rules not there, therefore, there was no reason for G4S to do anything different? Or were the rules there and they didn't follow the rules and there was a failure of leadership? You really got to look at the other articles. The CLEAT and the Pew Trust examples talk about the fact that there is no standard for licensing or verifying or checking or training security guards in the United States. In some states, it's a matter of come in, interview, and that night you are on an armed post with no training, no background check, nothing. In other states, it takes a minimum of 40 hours training, which to me is very low, but still it requires training, background check, psychological tests, and licensing. The Federal Protective Service, it's our federal government. The Federal Protective Service, an organization which some of you may go to work for someday, provides security for government facilities. And the FPS has the same issues with security personnel. Is this poor management? Is this, the rules aren't in place to protect the protectors, to protect the government buildings that these people are protecting? Or is it that the rules are in place and the companies that are supplying people just aren't following them? And then we have to talk about vicarious liability, which means that vicarious liability means the employer is responsible for the conduct of the employee. And in some cases, that may be true. In other cases, it can't be true. For instance, if an employee commits suicide while on the job, how could an employer be responsible for that? They cannot. The person took their own life. They made that decision, be it from a position of health or non-health mentally, but they made that decision. The employer is not liable for a case of suicide on the job. However, if the employer arms someone and they use that firearm and they shoot someone and we find out that the person had a history of shooting people, had previous shooting incidents, and the employer did not do proper screening, did not train the person how to use the firearm, did not give them a use of force policy to understand, then there is some liability on the part of the employer. So you have to understand where the employer's liability starts and stops, and that's really a variable based on many factors. But there's the argument of the employer is responsible for what their person does, and there's the free will that that person can do what they want. The employer can't stop it, can't foresee it. Therefore, where does the liability lie? Really, it comes down to foreseeability. Should the employer have been able to foresee the actions of the employee and taken steps to stop it before it happened? When you're making your argument, which you will make in your discussion this week, I want you to use these articles as well, the CLEAT and Pew Trust examples and the FPS example, to understand the management side. What is in place as far as rules? Have governments and companies and others put rules in effect that actually protect us from bad security guards? And if they have, is the problem that we're not following those rules? So are they there? Is management in place? And are we following them? Is leadership in place, or is it some combination of both? Going back to the articles, because the reading is the important thing this week, right? What you're going to base all of your work on. How much of this problem is regulation and controls? I mean, are the different rules from different states? I mean, look, there are a lot of border towns. It would not be unthinkable for somebody from Pennsylvania to go to Ohio to go to work. People do it all the time, and vice versa. So if Pennsylvania requires that a security officer be licensed and be trained, and Ohio does not, and I have, the need to make some money right away and don't have time for the training, maybe I just hop across the border and get my security job in Ohio. Is that hodgepodge of rules and the lack of rules in some places causing the issue? Again, management failure. Did we have processes in place? I mean, if there are no processes in place, if we have no rules and we have no requirements, then we can't expect to have a great outcome. In this case, there's no leadership to fail. But if indeed we had those rules in place and those regulations were in place, did we just not follow them? Did leadership fail? Do we have a culture of compliance? Are we obeying the rules that we set for ourselves? And then there's another argument. Is some of this competition driven? If we had a high quality competitor, someone who just said, these are our internal rules, we never violate those, and that's the way it is, and our record will show that we don't have these problems, would that force the others to do the same? Now, at the same time, that competitor would be more expensive. We're seeing that some of these issues that happened in this article were to cut costs and to fill posts, right? Which if you don't fill the post, you don't get paid for it. So would a high-quality competitor make a difference? Potentially could. They could also go out of business very quickly if it came down to, as you saw in the one case, the chief of police from a city that was using private security to man their jail saying, we'll take the price drop, thank you, as opposed to taking the warning that quality would suffer. So those are really the arguments that can be made on any side of this particular issue with the G4S case. And you're going to make that argument for us this week. So in this week's discussion, you're going to make an argument. You are going to pick one of those first four on this list to be your argument, and I will spell these out in the discussion. First argument, management was in place, but leadership failed. That's a moral argument. We said we were going to do certain things. We didn't do it. That was the failure. Second argument is leadership was in place, but management failed. We don't have the rules in place. We're willing to enforce the rules, and we're doing the best we can inside the framework that's been given to us, but there are no rules or laws in place. So, we did what we could do, but the rules just weren't there. That's the legal argument. We can say the system failed as government did not provide proper guidelines and regulations to protect the public, period. The regulatory argument. The reason that all of these things happen is there is no standard security guard law across the United States or state to state even that has enough teeth in it to provide for the protection of the public. That's a regulatory argument. And finally, we have the individual responsibility argument. Individuals commit crimes. Companies are responsible if they entice those people, encourage them, or participate in the criminal act by direct actions. In the case where the security guard raped the housekeeping employee, the company did not authorize that. They didn't participate in it. They didn't encourage it. There was no direct action by the company. The individual made the decision to commit that crime, and therefore he is responsible for that crime. That is that argument. So again, was management in place? We had the rules, but we didn't follow them. Was leadership in place, but we didn't have the rules? We were more than willing to enforce them, but we just didn't have the rules, the right rules written. Even if we had rules, we didn't have the right ones. And so that's where we failed. Was it the government's fault because they don't provide us with an oversight like they do for every other industry to say this is what you have to have in order to be a security guard in this state or in this country or even in this county, as we do with police officers? Or are we just going to say that, look, people commit crimes, and that is what people do, and we can go through and do all the background checks we want, all the training we want, but you have to understand that people are responsible for their own conduct. They have free will, and therefore there's an individual responsibility argument to be made here. Now, there could be other potential positions. I'd be happy to hear them, I guess, but I'd like you to pick one of these because I think really they are the four major arguments that you can make as to what went wrong in the G4S case study. So in your discussion this week, you're going to pick one of those positions, one of those four, and you're going to defend it with evidence and references. Now, whichever one you pick, it's your opinion. Pick the one that most resembles what you think after you read them. I mean, it's your opinion. It's not right or wrong. It just is. Okay? But you have to support it. You can't just say, well, I think this and I think that and I think that. You have to say, I think this because of, and you have to use references that are supportable. Okay? There's a lot of reading and a lot of references you can use. You know, because Cleat said that they just have a backlog and they can't get their work done, I believe that the government argument is there, and it is a failure of government leadership. They have the rules, but they don't have the means to enforce them. Therefore, it's a government leadership failure. You could make that argument. I'm not saying that's the right one or the wrong one. I'm just saying that's one you could make. But you support it with the Cleat article and the Pew Trust article in that case. If you say that G4S just had the management rules in place and didn't follow them because they're more concerned about profits, then you say because they did this, 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 and this, here the rule was in place. We can show this, that there was a rule in place in this, and they didn't do it. They didn't go back and do a background check. They didn't background check this person properly, even though they should have, and their own rules said they would. You can make that argument, but support it with things from the articles or other articles. You don't need to tell me why the other ones are wrong, because they're not wrong. None of them are wrong. They are all different opinions on what went wrong. We all agree something went horribly wrong here when that many people get arrested in a field for things that should have been caught somehow. But you don't need to tell me why the other ones are wrong. And in your discussion, you're going to apply a path forward, okay? That's going to tell us, okay, now you tell us what went wrong and why it went wrong, what failure was there of the one of the four. Now you have to devise a bit of a plan forward to help correct that. So by path forward, you're going to actually do it for 3 different entities. Once you determine what argument you want to go with, and you support that argument with references, you need to use those references and what you've learned to devise a path forward for G4S specifically. What should that particular company do to change their ways and have a better outcome? Then, in a separate paragraph, a path for the industry, for the security guard industry as a whole, not just G4S, but what should everybody else do? Are there other things that the industry itself should be done? And then a path forward for regulation. Okay? Nationally, regionally, by state, what should we be doing potentially to help with a regulatory oversight that might help preclude these types of problems that G4S had in the article? I say internationally, that one's unlikely because international laws are really different when it comes to all kinds of labor. So you're not really going to find one that says everybody in the globe needs to do it this way. But if you want to think nationally, or you want to think by state, or you want to think by region, that's cool too. But a path forward for regulation. Is there any change in regulation needed? Yes or no? And if so, what's needed? And how would we set that up and enforce it? Okay, so here's the format for your discussion. I'm going to lay it out for you. In paragraph 1, you're going to state your position. Which one of those choices do you pick? And you can say why in the first paragraph, generally from your opinion. In paragraph 2, you're going to give solid references to support your position. Why do you think that way? Well, because the article or other articles I've read say this, 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 and this. In the third paragraph and beyond, you're going to talk about a path forward for G4S, the industry, regulation. You can do it in one paragraph. I would suggest you're going to need more than one to do it, but you can do one per, up to you. And then in a final paragraph, I want you to give an implication or a path for an individual security manager, for you in the future, how you can avoid what happened to G4S as a customer of them. Okay? You're using a security guard company. How can you as a customer avoid some of those things happening at a facility where you're the security manager and you're using a contracted security agency? That will be your last paragraph. There are 3 responses due this week. Only respond to those who selected a different position as yours. If you decided that this was a failure of management because there weren't enough rules in place by the company, then don't answer back somebody else saying, yes, I absolutely agree with you. That's the same position I had. Good job. I don't want to hear that. You're going to respond to somebody who selected a different position as yours. You're going to give one reason why you support their position and one reason why you would not support their position. Every position is supportable in some way. If you say it's a failure of management and I say it's a failure of leadership, I can find reasons why you're right, and you can find reasons why I'm right, and that's what you're going to do. So, respond to somebody. You're going to give a reason why you support their position, and a reason why you don't support your position. Each one of those responses is going to be a minimum of 100 words, and I will be counting, as you know, and there are 3 required by Sunday. Now, I want to make sure that everybody understands what a disclosure is. A disclosure is that when you do any academic work, if you have any ties at all to anything in that academic work, it is fair for you to your readers and or your students to disclose that. So, which is what I'm doing here. And so generally, let's just say you have a child that's employed by a supplier. You're going to tell your employer that that's the case. You don't want them setting up a contract with somebody where you have a kid working for them. The conflict of interest is what we're talking about. So here's my disclosure. My company is a G4S customer in some areas, not in areas that I have direct work with. However, I do know people in the company. I know some of the people that were mentioned in that article, quite frankly. Doesn't sway me. Don't be afraid to hurt my feelings. I'm the one who brought this up and bringing it forward as a great case study of things that can go wrong in our industry and something that future security managers should be well aware of. So, but I want to make sure that everybody understands that I do have friends, I will call them friends, at this company. It's a big company and it's a small industry in the long run. So, I have friends at that company and others mentioned in the articles. So there's my disclosure, just so you know. But again, don't let that sway one way or the other because, frankly, I can make arguments. I can make all 4 of those arguments and make them stick. So you go ahead and have your way with it. So this week was all about the reading, and there's a fair amount of it. But I find it fairly interesting, and especially news articles, they tend to read a little better, quite frankly. The lecture was mostly about the reading and the discussion. It really is a bridge this week. So I want you to learn from the reading and apply the reading in your discussion. Discussion is the heartbeat of this week, for sure. Your initial post of 250 words or more is due Thursday at midnight, 11:59. And your responses are due Sunday at 11:59, essentially midnight. I use 11:59 because it makes us understand that it's not midnight the next day. Midnight always gets confused. Which day are you talking about? Thursday, 11:59, initial post, 250 words or more. Lay it out as formatted. If you have anything less than 4 paragraphs in there, you didn't get it right. And those who have been submitting 1 paragraph, expect to have your work kicked back because we're beyond that now. And then your responses, 100 words apiece minimum. 3 of them due by Sunday at midnight. With that, have a great week. If you have questions or concerns, please get a hold of me. I'm always available to you, and my contact information is in the syllabus. Have a great week.